Hami Takiapi, Aaron Griffin, and Makiapie, Sisi Tuan Wakpe Tuan Oyate Ki Hamataha, Kaksiza Hanska Edwati, Westerman Wichonji Ki Hamataha, Naku, Wamanicha Ota Beduhe, Wicha Beduhe. SDSU Ekda Khatawani. Yeah. So I'm Erin Griffin. Thank you, Kai, for inviting me here today. I'm really, really happy to be here with everybody. And also I see you, Thomasina and Rami. Nice to see you guys on here too. I am from the Sistine Wapton Oyate, and I live about 7 minutes outside of Sistine with all of my animals. And I currently work at South Dakota State University as a visiting assistant professor of the Dakota language. So I'm looking forward to the conversation.
Pass it over to Leona.
Omidakiafi, Leona Antoine Matiafi, Sichangu Lakota Oyate, Himataha Himataha na, Ashke Gluipi Tioshpaye, Himataha. My name is Leona Antwine, and I work with NECDC Financial Services out of Browning, Montana, but I work remotely from Lawrence, Kansas, and I'm from the Rosebud Sioux tribe, the Ashke Gluipi Tioshpaye, and yeah, I don't know. I live here in Lawrence and don't have a lot of animals. I have a love-hate relationship with my dog. And I really am excited to be on here with you all today because I miss all of you, and I'm here to learn and to share where I can. So thank you, Kai.
Jerry.
Bonjour, Jerry Homerike Indigenous Cause, Gawin Mashi and Gakindazin and Anishinaabe Janakazwin, Asabikane Zagi Eganing and Ninjaba. Oh wow, I almost said Massachusetts. Not true, New Mexico. And I'm Jerry Homerike. I'm a descendant of the Boys Fort Ojibwe, where my mom's a citizen. Basically, I'm sitting on the bench waiting for them to call me up to play. But I currently live in New Mexico. My wife's is Dene, so we're living here in her homeland. So Yate, Shadane, Bridget, and any other Dene out there. I'm currently where I fill a couple roles at San Carlos Apache College. I'm a faculty in the English department. I teach composition, fiction, and poetry. I'm also the director of curriculum assessment and institutional research. I work remotely. They're based out of San Carlos, Arizona. But yeah, I'm working from my kitchen currently. So I'm just really excited to be here to see friends, long time friends, and some new faces as well. So miigwech.
Awesome. So I'll share a little bit some of the thinking that I have in this space, and when I was kind of trying to help frame the conversation in terms of some of the thinking, these are some of my thoughts. And there was a previous session that I had, the first podcast, in which it was kind of like about the history of Two-Spirit people. And Two-Spirit people, of course, is more of a pan term for Indigenous people specifically. There are very specific terms for people that identify in terms of like gender variants that are specific to tribes. But in that one, what I found myself asking a lot of questions about and thinking about was language. And I know that with this group specifically, we've talked a lot about the intersections of women and Two-Spirit and land, and especially violence in those spaces. But then also, I was thinking about empowerment and the kind of empowerment or activism or action or movement in those spaces and that can come from those spaces. And I was thinking about how binary our conversations can be. Like, even when we talk in these spaces, it's always like we talk about Black-white relations, or we talk about white Indigenous relations. We talk about men and we talk about women, but we don't necessarily aren't able for some reason to house like all of these different intersections and conversations in one at one time. And I was thinking that really that all of these things are different arms on like one larger body. And in some ways, it's some of the things that I'm thinking about and we might be talking about is like oppression. And that there is some intent in there in terms of us not all talking about all of the things at one time, kind of segregating those out or isolating the conversations. And then I was thinking about how my initial reaction is to say that at the center of all those things, that oppression or that violence or those things that happen, is a desire for resources and power. And in order to get resources and power, you need to move whatever is in the way of those things out of the way. But then, and that's when you use things like racism, misogyny, homophobia, and things of the like to warrant decision making. But then I had to ask, well, where do those things come from? Where does that thinking come from? And that took me to the space of thinking about worldviews and values and culture and language. I did it in the first podcast, and I'll probably do it in almost every podcast, which is refer to the movie Arrival. Because the only reason I do it is because the focus in that show is on language, but to me, it was less about the words and more about relationship. It was more about like the relationship that informed what is the meaning and use of words. But when I think about intersectionality, I do think about kinship and I do think about relationship. And while we all have different experiences of living in the world, like it is all one collective history and narrative that we're part of. And specifically within Indigenous concepts and understandings of relationship, language does reflect how everything is related. But then through colonization, relationship is harder to grasp. And again, this is, my thoughts is like, because it is embedded in the language is objectification and like positions of superiority. And so I guess thinking about like the different ways those are manifested. But then, so some of the questions that I've like been thinking about, and again, that can help us have a conversation, but who knows where it's going to go. It's like, why Two-Spirit people? Why women? Why Indigenous people? Why people of color? Why people why relatives that are disabled? Like, why? And then also, what is intersectionality? And the first word that comes to my mind is like convergence, almost like thinking about like a river. And then I was like wondering, well, why is there even intersections of discrimination and oppression? And again, why aren't we able to talk about multiple identities and areas of discrimination in one conversation? And why do we often have to we end up talking about the symptoms, which are like oppression and discrimination, and not the source. And then I have a question, especially when it comes to, and this is language that you see, especially when you're looking at like environmental activism and environmental movements and the history of environment, from a non-native anthropological standpoint, but why is the same language often used to describe women and land? And here there's a person named Ocean Vuong that is a poet that I really like. They are from Saigon, Vietnam. And they talk about the power of storytelling and narratives. And they talk about how in order to harness resources, that you need a story, you need a narrative to motivate people to do something. And so there's like no conversation that I can really have in these spaces where I don't think about language and the history of language, and but before language, what informed those thoughts, the thought process, the value. And then I also woke up at like 2 o'clock in the morning thinking about erasure as a form of storytelling. Because a lot of times there's a lack of information around in a lot of spaces. And I was like, that's also storytelling. And so just quickly, in some of those questions, I was listening to someone else speak, and they talked about some of the reasons that we can't have these conversations that are about more than one thing at one time is because of trauma and because of they use the term scarcity, that people have a feeling of scarcity, and not just in terms of like actual things, but space, visibility, emotion, bodies, spiritually, and in historical narratives. So it's like if somebody else is taking a space or talking about their experience, then that means that the other person is not getting to share their experience, or they're not being heard. And so it can feel like something is being taken from you when someone else is getting focused on. So erasure. And then one of the things that they said though is they talked about entitlement, and they said there's a difference between entitlement and erasure. And entitlement is being able to say my narrative is the only narrative, which I'm sure that we're all familiar with. But that there are multiple truths, and they said multiplicity of truth is healing, which I really appreciated. And that they mentioned like that patriarchy and colonization take many, many nasty manifestations and forms. And one of the things that they said, and this is where like I was actually like smudging and praying earlier before this conversation. And again, I was kind of like, this is not a conversation to have by yourself. Like, yeah, I've got a million thoughts and ideas, but like, who am I alone? And so I was thinking about you all joining the conversation, and they said maybe our superpower is interdependence, which to me is like kinship. So I was like, so I thought about that like when I was smudging, and I was just like, it made me feel really good, because I was like, yeah, like it is. That is our superpower, is interdependence, and relationship. And so with that, those are some of my thoughts. And there's lots of words and things, but yeah, I'm gonna pause and give space for any thoughts or ideas our friends have. Just jump in whenever.
I was waiting for Leona. I have so much to say about all of that, but I was trying to think of like what a good point of jumping off is. And I think, what you said in the very beginning about arrival, the theory that they use in that film is the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis. And it's basically that your perspective and your worldview will determine, you know, how you perceive the world around you, how you understand the world around you. And language is I suppose a manifestation of that worldview. And I think within the society that we live today, it's really difficult to comprehend or understand that, and to accept that there might be different ways of understanding. And as Indigenous people, we have pretty deep connections to other ways of understanding, but a lot of times we've been disconnected from those. And I think, you know, I get to experience that on a regular basis, working so closely with the language, where we're often doing translation work. And you know, we see a lot of translations where people want these really intricate English phrases translated directly into Dakota. And it just doesn't work that way. So sometimes I have to actually translate the English to understand what the English is saying in order to translate it in Dakota. And just yesterday, I was meeting with a group of friends, and we were talking about the origins of words. And there's a word for like pig, kukushe. And my friend was a part of a class trying to figure out where that word came from or what it meant, because it's not a Dakota word. Like it is a Dakota word, but it comes from a different source. And it comes from French. I think it's pronounced couchant for pigs. So we have words like that in Dakota. Like even our language, you know, over the last few hundred years has been influenced by other perspectives, by other cultures, so that the meaning of some of our language has even changed. So our relationship, the relationship we have with the language today, is different than even our grandparents' relationship with it, and their grandparents' grandparents. So there's been dramatic change over time, because of those influences. And I think, you know, some of what you're talking about too, with, you know, this intersectionality, but an inability to bring all of these pieces into the fold and into the conversation. I think ultimately what it goes back to is what we've talked a lot about too, is those gaps in knowledge and understanding, where there's just pieces missing. So I'll stop there, because I want to hear what everyone else has to say.
You want me to go next? I think kind of going off of what Aaron had just brought up about like the language being different from one generation to the next. There's that the evolution of, I don't know if it's evolution, if that's the right word, but the changes from one lifestyle to the next and all the different phases that it goes through. And so starting with pre-colonial times, like the language was definitely different in the relationship with it. And within the family unit, there were differences too, like the intergenerational homes and connections to the land. And as you start to see like the move onto reservations and the change in housing, going from a naturally made shelter for a home into a structure, permanent structure that's built that completely tries to push out that natural world and like domesticates plants and animals and things like that to be able to live in whatever version of home you're in at that point. You start to see the change in relationships with that, and it becomes replacing relationships with material items. And with each phase, you start to see that gap get bigger and bigger. And so thinking about taking that back to that system of interdependence, like that kinship system, and looking at those definitions of words and phrases. And I was listening to a podcast. It was actually from Fort Peck College, and they had I can't remember if he was Lakota or Dakota, the speaker, but he talked about the term for younger brother, and it's misu. And it's actually, the way we say is like, oh, it's little brother. That means little brother. But the term actually comes from, it's describing, I'm braiding my younger brother's hair. And it comes from an older sister. It describes an older sister who would braid her younger brother's hair, like that care that goes into it. And the relationship, it's describing that relationship, like she was the one who would braid his hair. And so then that is where the term comes from. So like misu, I braid or I fix the hair. And then you start to think about that, and like that's just one word, and you kind of dissect that, you know, and you break it out and really examine it, and you start to think about other terms too, and where we lost those connections. And so it's not just little brother that, you know, sometimes siblings fight, whatever, but it's like this actual like care in that relationship. And it describes protocol, describes, you know, there's so many different things that happen there just in that one term. And I don't know, Jerry, passing it to you, Jerry.
I was definitely rolling around a lot with language and words in all of this, particularly when we think about how different languages are gendered, and even the word gender. And I was looking at obviously, those who know me, the etymology and the history of that word. And if you were to graph it on a timeline, gender as a noun and gender as a verb sort of follow parallel to each other until about the 60s. And then gender as a noun takes off. And there's this huge gap kind of between the two. And when we look at kind of the root of that word, because that word didn't originate, it's not an English or an Anglo-Saxon word at all. It comes from Latin, and it means group, just a grouping. When we look at grammatical gender, and that it's really tough because in less English, but German for sure, you have masculine, feminine, and what they call neuter nouns, right? And if you were to try to apply for a job in Germany, because of that gendered language, they include a parenthetical to note that anyone can apply to the position, because maybe the position takes on a masculine form. But I mean, those terms, like how they're grouped within languages, in Ojibwe, it's animate or inanimate. In some African languages, it's like human, big things, little things. And it's less about, like I learned it's less about the semantics or the meaning of the word, and more about the morphology and the sound and the ending of the words that cause them to be grouped. So we could call it group A, group C. And it seems like, I mean, there's certainly different linguistic theories about why we've labeled it something masculine. Only that grouping of nouns happen to have a majority of things we would socially, right, ascribe to as male, socially ascribe to as female. But there are certainly, and really that's only about a quarter of the world's languages that have that type of grammatical gendering. Like the majority of the world's languages don't have, they're gendered in completely different ways. And I mean, certainly your questions have made me think about, yeah, the languages and the words that we use, and really, yeah, the relationships, right, that where those words emerged from, the thoughts behind them, the actions between two or more beings. Yeah. It's kind of where I was going with initially.
That's awesome. Just all this affirmation of being so glad that we're having this conversation together. There's a podcast, and I can't remember the lady's name who does it, but it's about etymology specifically. She goes in a lot of different places, but I was just like, man, I appreciate her, but I would much rather listen to this podcast about etymology. I was just like, yes, this is awesome. That's nerding out. But well, I mean, part of the reason actually like that, so in that first podcast, like I was really getting hung up on language, but it's partially because I was looking back at his like historical references to like multi like gender variant people and some of the language that was used, and they were saying like euphemisms to describe people, and it was like they were calling them sodomites, and they were, you know, referring to them in these like really harmful kind of ways that um essentially just portrayed them in a way that was against, you know, against the word of God, and against creation. And at the same time they were um effeminating men, like indigenous men, because they didn't look like or perform like the people that were like showing up on the shores, you know. And um and I also thought it was interesting, and I think we brought this, I think Aaron, we might have started to talk about this a little bit right at the end, but it was like there was also hardly any mention of women at all. It was like there was, and that's when I was also thinking about erasure, just like a lack of mention in some of these things. But so I mean, I couldn't even like have the conversation or any, you know, without thinking about all of this. And Jerry, you mentioned gendered terms, and that's also one of the things that I saw more consistently um in like indigenous people's descriptions about themselves, was that it was more about a role or responsibility in the community, as opposed to terms specifically that describe like your gender, like, or your anatomy. And was like, well, what do you do? How do you perform? How do you function? and that is broadly, like, I will not say that that is obviously true for every tribe or every indigenous group, but it was pretty consistent. But then I was thinking, man, all of the things you guys shared, my brain was just like, ah. I felt like Godzilla going. I was just like, ah, all the information. So whenever you were talking about like decoding language, and then Leona, when you were talking about like the homes and intergenerational, like when you were describing the home, it made me think of like stagnancy, and it made me think of something that is alive but that then becomes stagnant, and then you change the language to reflect the stagnancy. Like you said, and I thought of the word domestication, like you change the language to then reflect like that domestication of things. And I thought about when we were in Mongolia, that they had said that like just in one generation of sending their kids to school, that they were not able to communicate with them. They were starting to lose the ability to talk to each other. And one of the things that stood out in my mind was they were describing a fiber, a braid that they make with hair from the yak. They make like a I guess like a bridle, and they started using synthetic fibers, synthetic ropes. And they said that even in the use or incorporation of that synthetic rope, that they like there's all this information embedded in getting that hair, how you get that hair, how you braid that hair, how you make that bridle, what it's for, because specifically it was like for weddings, it was for different, there was reasons that they were doing it. And like all that information they were losing because of they were now using a synthetic fiber. And I can see why, for anyone that is listening or people that might listen later, like the conversation of like Two-Spirit people and women and like land and all those things might not specifically be like the thing that we're talking about. But when I'm trying to understand and look back and learn about these things, and when we are talking about those relationships and who we are, like these are the kinds of spaces that I wonder into, definitely, because I'm like, well, why is it talked about this way? Well, why are we talked about this way? Why can't we find the information? Why does the information sound like this? And it is like all about that perception, that the understanding that you're walking in with, and then not seeing something that you recognize and being like, whoa, 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 no. And then they call it something else, and they make it derogatory, and then they go about telling everyone that that's the story. So yeah, it's really, really well. All right, I'm gonna be quiet for a minute unless someone else talk.
I think part of that is too, like taking on that, you were saying like that outsider perspective of who you are, and taking on like that colonized perspective or history of you and your people is a big thing. And when we think about that, like those, you think about identity, and I feel like that's a big part of this too, is having that identity and that change that came with it. And to now where we almost like play into it. And a lot of that is like with erasure is looking at like in our country today, the for example, when I taught back in Rosebud on the res, we had a lot of focus on the Holocaust, and we had a lot of literature that was brought in for students to learn about the Holocaust. And there were stacks of books, and we didn't have very many on our own history and our own culture and our stories, you know, and having to like balance that out was a struggle, which was really surprising and not surprising, you know, at the same time. And thinking about that, like why it's easier to tell somebody else's story instead of telling our own story. And even when it happened to us, you know, it's like hard for us to correct that information too. But you think about that with like where we see ourselves today. And like as an Indigenous woman, if I look around the area where I live, like the Kansas City Chiefs is probably like the portrayal of who we are. And then you look at other schools, and there are mascots like that on our reservations, and those all come from those BIE schools, and they come from those missionary schools. And we take on that identity that's not even ours. You know, it's that version that was made up for us to tell us who we are. And so there's like all these, like you're saying, that intersectionality, when the further away that we get from those relationships is the further away that we get from our true identity. And we start like even realizing who we really are as people. And you start to lose that strength, but it's not gone forever. You know, it'll always come back. And like, and thinking about that, like how we reclaim our identity through our own narratives, through our stories. And there's different ways that happens, you know, like when you start to see physically, that's a huge reminder of like our presence. And then that is like importance too. But when it comes from us, you know, and we start to see our place and combat that erasure. And so thinking about just like ways to do that too, especially for the next generation, you know, like they need to be able to see themselves in positive ways coming up versus what's here right now.
Oh, I did unmute. I like what Leona is saying, and I think it's a difficult thing to be able to combat that erasure when we don't know what's been erased. Because, you know, what years, I don't know, like almost 200 years, maybe more 150, you know, we've been told a certain thing, like generations and generations and generations of our families have lived with a certain story that was really bred with missionaries. And the story, the foundation of that story is this binary existence, that it's man and woman, either or, and it's difficult to imagine what else there might be. And I think, you know, thinking about Wink does, but also you mentioned people with disabilities in the beginning. And what other roles were there that we just don't know anymore? When I was doing my research, I was trying to figure out what the strengths of Dakota womanhood looked like prior to contact, prior to colonization and assimilation. And it was so hard to find anything to begin with. But then I started noticing these patterns, and what I ultimately realized was that Dakota womanhood didn't change a whole lot, because the pattern remained the same over the time period that I was looking at, that women helped each other. And women stepped into these different roles, and they were always there. If I gave these examples yesterday, if, you know, one of us was sick, then someone else or a few other people would step in and help plant the garden or harvest the garden. If a woman was giving birth, the person that helped her was, you know, her sister or her sister-in-law or a female relative. Like those were the midwives. And even the people that carried the medicine, like the references I saw were women. Example after example, they talked about the women having that knowledge and that responsibility within the community. And I think about these things today, you know, how difficult it is as a woman to move through certain spaces and to be listened to, even working with language is very difficult. And so I guess, like, going back to what I was saying, like, you know, it's difficult to think about what else there could be, but the understanding is there if we look in the right places. And so that goes to, again, what Leona was saying about you know, being in connection with the land and how we live. How we live is critical to how we understand the world around us. You know, are we paying attention to the movements of the stars? There's a lot of answers in the universe that can tell us the things that we need to know. And even the movement of nature. Again, Leona was the one that got me thinking about that, you know, the seasons and our flow with the seasons is so critical to all of that. But returning to those things can help us see something different and help us understand something different if we can reconnect to that. Your turn, Jerry.
Oh my gosh. Everything, I can feel it. My head's like just firing all sorts of synapses. Oh, oh. I you know, I think about erasure, how stories presented. Kai, you shared in one of the emails the animation and the story of those 4 stones. I got that email the day after I got back from Waikiki. I did not see those stones. That story, right, is not something like, and Waikiki's a huge tourist area, so there's people are there for other purposes too. But that was such an important story. And thinking about, you know, language and story. Language is alive. You know, the Western world might want to say our languages are dying or dead, but they aren't. They are alive. And I mean, language is that it's the spoken, it's the written, it's the visceral code of our thoughts and our actions. And I think about how if we don't see ourselves in the language, who says we can't create that? Right? If our thoughts, I think my daughter the other day, Avery, she had a kind of a rough day at school and immediately got in the car and was just unloading and finally caught herself and said, "Oh, sorry, Dad, I'm going on a rangent." And I took me a moment. I thought, a rangent. what an interesting word. And she said, she goes, oh, did I say rangent? I meant a rant. And I said, well, it was like a rant and a tangent, right? And she's like, yeah, that's what it felt like. And in that moment, I thought, yeah, I mean, intersectionality, that word as a theoretical concept wasn't born, or articulated right until late 80s, I want to say. I'm not it's like, correct me if I'm wrong on that date, but I feel like it's new, right? Why can't we do that? And I do feel like it's women, it's Two-Spirit, it's non-binary people who are doing that. It certainly ain't coming from men. If anything, I should have had a disclaimer at the beginning that said I don't speak for San Carlos Apache College. I only speak for myself. So I'll throw that in there now, but we men have been in the way. I'll admit there's definitely times in my life where I've been in the way, not just myself but others. And we can create these words. We're like the best storytellers in the world. We create ceremonies that never existed because of what colonization does, right? I think about museums and rematriating our ancestors and how we have to create all these things. We are creators, and we can do that with language too, I think. Grab that pencil from that person's hand and flip it around. Don't let them erase.
While we're talking, I like looked back at the question, like why women and why Two-Spirit people and like why land, and I was like, oh, I don't know. But then as you continue talking, I was like, oh, obviously, like it's that power, the power of like community, the power of kinship, and like Aaron, as you were talking, it's the power that they have, and not as a resource. Yes, we're resources, but like not as a resource, but just like that. I don't know, like life, that power, that like vitality and vibrance and all of those things. The ability to like come together, the ability to show up, the ability to do those things, um, and that's why, you know. And so, like thinking back to like intersectionality, well, that's why. Um, and it's kind of like it's one of those questions that there's probably a million other times that I was like, I wouldn't have asked that question because I would have thought, oh, I already know the answer. But then, I guess questions also transform and change so that you can ask them different ways and answers can present themselves different ways. But I was when you were talking about language being many things, Jerry, like that's the other thing I think with colonization, right, is that language is often so much focused on as word. Communication is focused on so much as word, as we write it, we wrote it, so now that's the way that it is. And you're right, it is alive and it is many things, and it is like, and Bridget actually, like, I mean, when we work together, a lot of times people would ask us, what is the relationship between environment and arts? And it's a very exhausting question to constantly have to try to answer. And to me, like, art is obviously like its expression, but it is a communicator. It's a transmitter of story. It's a transmitter of where you're from, what kind of materials you have, where you are, what are the elements and the things that are around you, how do you use them? And so even thinking about like all of these other languages, and it's so interesting too, because I know a lot of times people will challenge they'll want to support Native art, but they'll only want to support a specific kind of Native art. And I know this was something that had come up before, and it's they'll want you to create something that is tangible that you can look at, that's beautiful, but they won't want you to create or to share the song that goes with that thing, or the story or the language behind the creation of that thing. And it's like, I mean, it's just, and but then again, like, where do all those things come from? And they come from where we are. They come from land. And so it's, again, like going back to this space, and it's funny because in all of these things, like, I definitely reflect upon my own actions, and like I'm not a man. I don't identify as a man, but I present as masculine person. And I have noticed people treating me differently because of it. Sometimes I'll be eating with people. I'll be eating with friends that are women, and I've had people talk to me and not them, even while we're at the same table. And have dudes kind of, hey, bro, like, try to talk to me about one thing, and I'm just like, really, I'm really not interested, in becoming part of that culture. Um, but it is awesome because of it. To me, it does require me, and it asks of me to think about my performance, how I look, how people assume that I am. And how, especially like my sisters and my partner and my friends and other like women around me, how they're treated, how others behave around them. My partner has a son, actually, and he's 13. And we all like to tease each other. We tease the heck out of each other. But like, sometimes I can think that, again, because of and he knows that I'm trans, that I identify as Two-Spirit, all these other things, but still, just like the space that I take, I think sometimes, you can get a little like boyish or like, mannish or whatever. And they'll start to be like, oh, mom does this, oh, mom does that, oh, mom, blah, blah, blah. And part of that is just a teenager like complaining or saying something, but it's like, then it's like my responsibility to be like, that's not how we talk about your mom. you know we show appreciation for her. We do things for her. We step up. We're helpful. We be helpful. We show respect. And I mean, yeah, there's joking, and then there's like that line of disrespect that has kind of come in there. And so those are some of the things that like I think about. But forever, I feel like I've thought about these intersections of this space, and I would say that first I did think about it with regards to women and land, and it was because of, you did see land described in these ways that were like how they were describing women, and to me it told me that language was used as a means of um, creating something that was less like, I guess, inferior, or that you could have, or that you could take, that you could possess. And so in those spaces, I really think again about language, and see the use of it in harmful ways. But then also, when I do think about, on the other end of it, the empowerment piece or the activism piece, like, the way that it becomes real clear to have a good way forward, or that we can do something, is when it comes to indigenous languages, to the ways, the things, like the worldviews, the understandings, the values that are in them. Which I know that we've all talked about too before, some of those differences, trying to translate in and translate out. But okay, I'll be quiet. Someone else's turn.
I think having gotten back into teaching the language, there's some things that I've been noticing that I think are very frightening. But you know, I also think that they've just been there a really long time, and I'm just now noticing. But there's you know, you ask, you know, why we don't talk about these things together, why it's always either or. And one of the things that I've been hearing repeatedly is this insistence that language and culture not be taught together. And when I was growing up, you know, everybody always said language and culture go together. They're hand in hand with each other. And it took me a long time to actually understand what that even meant. Like, what does that even look like? But now I'm hearing the exact opposite of that across multiple spaces, and it's very scary. And I think it suppresses our abilities with the language in so many ways, whether it's to learn or teach or understand. And it's contributing to this idea that has been perpetuated again since missionaries came and started usurping our language. This idea that there's only one way, and it needs to be this way because that's the way you'll learn it. And so there's a rejection of all these other things. It's this idea that, you know, things that have been translated, that's the only word that you can use for that. And, you know, I've tried really hard to give examples to people of how descriptive the language is, and that is a beautiful thing, that we can describe what we see and experience around us with the language that we have. And it's not just one way, because what I experience here in Sisseton is going to be different from what you experience over there in Fort Peck. So, you know, we're going to have to talk about different things. Different things might be happening with the weather. Different things might be happening with people. We might describe things differently. One of the examples I gave my students was coffee. I gave them 4 different ways to say that. I grew up learning Pejuta Sapa, black medicine. Here in Sisseton, people say Minikata. Up in Canada, they say, I only just learned this like a year and a half ago, that some people said Kafina. And then I've heard Wakaliapi, like Wakaliapi, but I haven't actually heard anybody use that. But there's all these different experiences that people have had with something as simple as coffee. And it's beautiful, and it's okay to say it in all these different ways. But we keep, we're told that no, that belongs in that box, that belongs in that one. You can only do it this way. And maybe like, I think it was 2 weeks ago, we were having our Christmas party, and I found out that one of my colleagues teaches medieval weaponry. And I thought, oh my gosh, that's so cool. I wish I could teach something like that. And then I stopped myself and I said, oh, I can teach something like that. I totally can. I can teach the language. I can teach the things that I know and understand, not necessarily medieval weaponry, but the things that I know and understand, I can teach those through the language. Teaching language doesn't have to be you learn your introduction and then you learn your numbers and colors, and it doesn't have to be in that order that has been prescribed to us by someone that is not Dakota. What's important is that we speak and we understand relationship to each other, because the language is about relationship. And it has to be interconnected with all of these other things in order to work. And we have to be able to talk about all these other things together with it. Okay, so
Are you gonna say something, Leona?
I was just sitting here going,
The other thing is I like kept this in an hour and a half because I was just like, I knew that I knew. I was just like, I already know. But anyone that is here, you can like if you can join in, you can say something, or because I know we have other language speakers here also. And so, but just putting that out there. Any thoughts right now? All right. Well, I have some. um, and this is only because now I have the opportunity to do it. So, and then here's your notes actually on animate and inanimate, Jerry. But the one thing that we're, and by where, I mean, me and Aaron are always trying to do is bring Godzilla into the conversation. And recently there's like a resurgence of interest in Godzilla. Probably because -1. I don't know. There's also a resurgence in D&D, Dungeons and Dragons. Again, I don't know. But I have also gone back and been watching these movies, and I know that I am not like an expert in this area to speak on these things, and that there are people that are really, really invested in Godzilla that would probably like shame me out and say a bunch of stuff. But originally Godzilla also did not have a specific gender. Their terms are also not necessarily like, it was more, and again, I don't think it is probably the accurate word, but it was a genderless term. And then once it became Americanized, they started to refer to it as he. And I heard some conversations recently, and they were talking about why, like, why do people think of Godzilla as he? It was interesting because at first they were talking about destruction. It was simply because Godzilla is always destroying things. They were like, oh, obviously it's a guy. Well, then there were other people that were listening into that conversation, and they were saying, but also like, why they started talking more about actually women and protecting something. Like, is Godzilla protecting something? Are they taking care of something? And in one of the films, Godzilla lays eggs. And so they're like, oh, it's asexual reproduction. But it's so interesting, the ideas and the notions that people have about what is masculine and feminine, and also what, in that situation, a parent, but especially like to me, a mother would do to protect. If they had eggs, or if they had like children or offspring. And so it's interesting though to see people just, I guess, make assumptions, and then also the need to gender something, the need to like create like it isn't Godzilla is a he, you know. I mean, it happens all the time, and I think in our own minds, definitely in my own mind when thinking about certain things. Um, Prayer is one of those. A lot of times when we reference creator, it's like he, a man, you know. And I think it's interesting to me, and that because we do speak English, that like there is that default of the he being kind of like the space taker, um, which I don't really know what to say about it. It's just interesting to me, but it is like it does seem like a default, like just a space that we go to. Um, and I don't know if the only way away from that is to learn to just not have that default and to use our languages, like if that's really the only way to just move away from that space. But yeah.
Makes me think of like the other defaults too, like how in the work we did at the College Fund when we worked with Indigenous women leadership, and how the role of caretaker was a default on women, and how there was always like that idea of women having to work harder to get to certain spaces, um, while having the role of caretaker, while, you know, just all these different things. And so like thinking about other defaults and how there's like mind shifts, you know, that you have to do to get past that, because it's something I really struggle with too. And I like that you said that about Godzilla, because I was thinking like, yeah, if Godzilla were a woman, like that's a really cool visual way to portray like a protector of something. And then you said that, and I was like, oh, cool. I don't know much about Godzilla. I don't know if I'll be invited back to the next one because I said that. But you know, just that. And if they were considered a woman as a protector, what kinds of negative connotations then are put on women when they protect and have to go to extremes, you know, and things like that. But I don't know. I was also thinking about intersectionality and like breaking that word down, and how we have to have that section in there as part of it to make it more of an inclusive type of word. Like we can't just take out that section. Like for some reason, it still has to be a part of it. And I was looking at the definition of intersectionality and inclusion. And if you take out the section, you take out the sections, do you just have inclusion then? Or is that still something that has those separations? I don't know. That's where I started going off with all of it too. And was just thinking of like, do we still make ourselves go through that roundabout way to get to the point? Because those defaults, do we default to that first before we get to the goal? I don't know.
Yeah, Jerry, the how do those all of those words, like what are the, is it prefix and suffix? Is that what they are? Because when you said that and you took section out, I was like, was it just like inner reality? Like it's just like a just create a new word, just like mash them up and make a new one.
I like it. Yeah. Interality.
Just like
Yeah. They're just suffixes which take verbs, and make them, let's see, first a noun, the verb sacked, to cut, the TION would make it a noun, yeah. And then the AL makes it an adjective, but then we got to make it a noun again, so we add the ITY. An abstract, yeah, abstract noun. That's what all those little word parts are doing.
What is an abstract noun?
It's a noun that you hold in your mind, not a tangible
Okay.
object, right?
So, okay. Person, not real place, thing. Or maybe.
Right. It's more of a state of being. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
I am an abstract noun.
But then yeah, I mean, your mind is, I would argue that thought is right. Yes, thought exists. So,
Mhm. Yeah.
but the inter means among or between. So between the parts.
Yeah, whenever I was looking at all this, like I was looking up some of those definitions, and so I shared some words that were like kind of to consider, and was like control, empowerment, activism, violence. And activism I thought was interesting because I'm assuming that they're like obviously action or something, but it's not a word that I think was really used before, like a lot before, which I don't know. And then kinship and relationship and identity. And it was actually, Leona, I was going back to something that you had written about the Indigenous visionaries, and I was looking at some of these like four cornerstones that you were kind of saying that were um, kind of essential to that space and acknowledging women. And um, it was about like learning and being related, and wellness. And I don't know, I was curious, like for the list of words that I sent, how those would translate. Things like discrimination, like how would that translate into like Dakota or Ojibwe, and um, empowerment or control or oppression, like how do those things translate? Um, I'm I can't even really imagine right now. Obviously, that would probably take some digging, but it's just, I mean, and I shared this in that first one, but that's one of the reasons that again that movie sticks out in my mind, because there were like 12 different groups of linguists around the world trying to decipher what these aliens were saying. And one of them was like, it's a tool. One of them was like, it's a weapon. And the other was like, it's a gift. And they're all translating it different ways. But based on the interpretation, then they're like, well, if it's a weapon, then how, we're going to respond through war. Um, they were less likely to listen to it being a gift. But it's, yeah, it's just interesting. And again, maybe this does not totally, like, if people are just like, what does this have to do with like being Two-Spirit and all these things? But it really does have so much to do with it, the language and understanding and the way that others describe us. And I think going back to like that superpower of interconnectedness and having all the conversations. And I think you're right, Leona, like even in my mind, like a lot of times when we've learned to talk about these intersections, and I guess the intersections of the oppressed, like because of the politics of things too. Sometimes I feel like we're like, well, I don't want to like, I don't want to leave anyone out. I don't want to exclude anyone. But then you're also like, how do you make a space for everyone? But then also, how do you prioritize? And it kind of gets like, it is hard for us to think of like all of the things at one time because of the nature of isolating, I think.
I wonder if that goes back to like what you were saying or what Erin was saying earlier about roles and responsibilities
Mhm.
versus like I'll have to look at my notes here, and making the space in that role, or around that role or around that responsibility. And so that would look different for different people versus like feeling like you have to, because there are times when you can't include everyone, because you look at who needs the support or who needs the acknowledgement at that time, good
Yeah.
and bad. And that piece was written with Erin too, so I have to give credit. It was co-written on Indigenous visionaries, so I want to make sure that that's out there. I don't know.
That's a good point, because there were specific times, specific moments, specific roles and responsibilities for things to occur that look much different than the spaces that we are creating now. And still through like a very Western lens.
And the other part too that I think you all kind of like remind me of too, and I would learn about different things from all of you, is like the different phases in life and how those aren't marked by age. They're marked by showing like that you can move from one phase to the next, and how those used to be acknowledged, how everybody moved at their own pace through different phases. And so there were different terms that were used to describe when you were in one phase versus another phase. So like moving from a Wikoshkalaka to a Wia, like what was the difference between the two, and how it might take somebody longer to move from that phase, Wikoshkalaka, like teenage almost, to being a woman, considered a woman in those responsibilities. And so it was like a really individualized way of working with somebody. It wasn't like a blanket approach. And there was like those expectations that you had, like you were saying, interdependence, where you were the best of yourself for the collective. But it was like an independent way or individualized way to get there. And so thinking about that too, with like, what are the needs that people have to get them to that point, to where they are part of the collective, like that reciprocal part, I think is what we really lack, especially in education systems today, and within our own homes, and things like that. It's really hard not knowing how to get back to that when, like Erin said, you don't know what it was before. And so just thinking about that, like getting back to that relationship based, I think gives you a better idea to like slow down and take that time to really get to know one another, and then look at those, how you move through life in those different phases.
Dang, you're so smart, Leona. So we're getting close to time, but I want to leave, if anyone like has any final thing they want to share, say. And also, again, if anyone in the session wants to say anything, I definitely invite you to. But Erin or Jerry, if there's anything y'all want to share.
I think just one last thing off of what Leona was saying is that, we're all born with specific responsibility, and we used to live in societies that helped shape that, like Leona was saying, and we don't have that anymore. And so oftentimes we get into these positions where we're expected to know everything. We're expected to know how to do all things, know all language, be a dictionary of language and culture if we're in those spaces or roles. And it's not like that, and it never has been, because each of us has a special role and responsibility. It's those things that we're passionate about. And if we can lean into those, then that's where the growth of our communities happens. That's where the growth of our families happens. That's where we begin to take care of the land and each other and the animals on it. And we see differently if we can lean into what makes each of us special and support each other in that.
Jerry, do you want to share anything before we go?
Guess I was just thinking, I guess the coming back to the word intersectionality, right? If each of those roles is a group or a section, the first part of that word inter, I quickly looked up the root of it, and the root relates to the connective tissue of our intestines. So it's this idea kind of in that it's what connects those groups, right? So all the facets of my identity, I can certainly say how different I am, or this is the group I belong to, and just stay in that group. Or I can say these are facets, and here's where it overlaps with other groups, and what is my role in all this? But here's what I can do. Use me for good. Our superpowers. We all have rings, right? And we can connect. But just thank you for inviting us all to get together. Our different roles came together today. Gwetch.
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah, I'm really appreciative. It's so good to just spend this little time together with everyone. I'm totally ready to just launch like a whole different session if we want to. I'm just like, yeah, sure. I know it multiple times we were like, yeah, we're gonna get together. Yeah, we're gonna get together. So maybe we will again sooner. Let's see. Yeah. I know being here, it feels like we are going to see each other again soon. I'm like, oh yeah. So I really appreciate it. And thank you all very much. We will share out the recording. I'm just going to apologize because I did not provide I didn't hit record before we did our introductions. So, but with that, unless anyone has a question or anything to say, I'm going to go ahead and let us close it out. I'll pause for just a moment in case there is anything. That was the moment. All right. Thanks everyone. Bridget, it's very nice to see you. Okay. See you guys. Doksha.
Bye.
Ika Wabba
Thank
Men
you.
Minoa.